Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. U.S.-China tensions have come to a head once again after China's latest move of barring U.S. naval ships from docking for rest and recreation in Hong Kong. Furthermore, they have sanctioned several American non-government organizations such as the National Endowment for Democracy, Human Rights Watch and Freedom House for acting, as they say, badly over the recent unrest in Hong Kong, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Now, all of this comes in retaliation to a bill the U.S. president signed into law last week that essentially spells out an annual review of Hong Kong on the basis that the city has enough autonomy to justify its special status with the U.S. Now, Beijing has called the passing of this bill a interference by the U.S. in its internal matters and has warned Washington, D.C. of countermeasures. Now, U.S. Ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, was also summoned on this occasion on Thursday and told that Washington's move was a serious violation of international law. Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, has also condemned the Human Rights and Democracy Act, saying it was wholly unnecessary and suggesting that it's done more harm than good, especially to the city's battered economy. So we'll be talking to our guests today to highlight not just this development, but also look into a bigger problem perpetuating the existing U.S.-China tensions. Let me introduce our guests who will be joining us. Mr. Einar Tangen, a political and economic affairs commentator, is joining us from Beijing, and Mr. Turgul Keskin, professor and director of the Center for Global Governance from Shanghai University, is joining us from Shanghai. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Now, let's start with you, Mr. Tangen. How do you, first of all, interpret the U.S. president's signing this very controversial bill and the kind of reaction it is getting?
I mean, this is something that Donald Trump was not looking for at this particular point in time. He was more concerned about his trade deal. Obviously, he's trying to change the conversation in Washington, D.C. away from his domestic troubles, especially this impeachment saga that's going on and threatens to continue to grab headlines. But it was something that he couldn't ignore. It had passed House by one vote against, and in the Senate by unanimous. So the obvious threat would be that it would be passed over any veto that he had. He gave the usual caveat that he reserves the right as the executive to determine how the things are done in terms of international relations, but he has signed it, and now Beijing, although not surprised, I would say that they're extremely concerned.
So, Mr. Keskin, would you also interpret that as a sort of an alarmed sort of reaction from Beijing? Are they really truly concerned, or their retaliation to you is also symbolic, considering the kind of relations that exist between the two leaders, or on a personal level between U.S. and China?
I think from my own perspective, my own observation, it's a very interesting process that we see since the Mike Pence speech at the Hudson Institute in 2018. Basically, between China and the U.S. is moving a different direction. This is before the Hong Kong crisis. It started with the actually Xinjiang issue, that U.S. is supporting certain activities against China. And remember, not just the Hong Kong bill. There was another bill. It was approved in September. It was proposed in the Congress in last January 2019, basically. I believe this Beijing is more careful reacting this than the United States. But this conflict between United States and China is not about the trade conflict, but it's going to be a political conflict. It's kind of new Cold War that how I see.
That's an interesting point. Mr. Tangen, this Cold War, as Mr. Keskin calls it, do you see it as the U.S. in a way also showing that they are involved with the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong? They're turning this local unrest, which in the general scheme of things for China is probably not that big a scale of a problem.
Well, I mean, yes, in terms of population, Hong Kong is about a rounding error. You're talking about 7 million people in a land of 1.4 billion. But Hong Kong is important to China symbolically. It was wrested back from the colonial powers of Britain after being taken in 1841. They're determined to keep it. And they believe that it is part of China and it will continue to be part of China. This is the very difficult part of this whole situation is that we're talking about people who want to, in essence, create a separate country, but that's not going to happen. And instead, what you're witnessing is this kind of ideological deterioration supported by shadowy groups that Beijing has identified and now put on this kind of watch list. Mm-hmm. And you're also seeing that these people in Hong Kong, they're using children. I mean, if this was any other place, you'd hear a lot of talk about using child soldiers. But when they start arresting 12 and 13-year-olds, and the majority of people on that campus were very, very young. We're talking, 300 of them were under 18. Yet I don't hear anything coming out of these things that these impressionable people were being used. So yes, it's part ideological, part it's this issue about tactics, especially by Donald Trump, and unfortunately it will continue.
And Mr. Keskin, where do you stand on the allegations that exist that the CIA is paying these Hong Kong demonstrators, some of them at least, and that the real aim that the U.S. has behind their interference in what is unfolding there is for a regime change?
Yeah, the United States foreign policy, we should remember this, changed in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s under the Reagan administration. Under the Reagan administration, the United States started to promote the democracy promotion, what we call, especially in the global south. China was included later, actually, especially after the Tiananmen. NED was established. Remember the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, that China basically banned, and Human Rights Watch, and another important institution, International Republican Institute, another one, National Democratic Institute. These institutions, they play a very important role in the democracy promotion after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics in Central Asia. And China is now very careful that, especially against this organization, and it should be careful. And I'm not sure who's paying the Hong Kong protesters, but most of the Hong Kong protesters, basically, who involved in the Hong Kong protests, most of them, they were born after China received the Hong Kong from the Britain. I'm not sure how much they are aware of the previous administration under the British colonialism in Hong Kong. So on the other hand, under the new political climate, especially in the after 2000, last 17, 18, 19 years basically, increasing trend of the China and rising trend of the China around the world alarmed the Washington, especially the last several years. And from my perspective, this containment policy of China started with the Obama administration, second term of the Obama administration. And this has nothing to do with Trump, but everything's to do with the establishment in DC, actually. And it will continue.
Right. So, Mr. Tangen, something that Ms. has very articulately highlighted here, the concern really is whether this is, the U.S. is actually concerned about democracy there in Hong Kong, about human rights. I mean, that's what essentially this law that they passed is, to personally sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials who they feel have sort of violated human rights during these protests. I mean, that's a big sort of hypocritical statement coming from the U.S. considering their involvement in so many human rights violations across the world. So, I mean, is it very far-fetched to interpret what is unfolding here in terms of these bills and laws, whether it's on munitions given to riot police in Hong Kong, is essentially about China's rise, not just economically, but also militarily around the world?
No, I would agree. Now, remember that under the American doctrine of American exceptionalism, we can do almost anything and justify it because the ends will justify the means. In essence, that we are leading the world towards the only one true path, which is liberal democratic capitalism. So, I mean, for the hardline ideologues in Washington, many of whom were in the Trump administration, they really wanted to press China. They see China as an existential threat, not only economically, but politically, because they have been able to succeed when everyone expected that they would, in fact, fail. So at this point, you have this kind of political ideological edge, which has changed about 180 degrees. If you go back to the time of of Mao, under Mao, China was very ideological. The U.S. was more pragmatic. Today, we've completely reversed positions. The Chinese tend to be pragmatic about things, and the U.S. is pushing an ideology that they cannot necessarily define and looks often hypocritical. But there are other issues behind it, and one of the main ones is this clash between the idea of the individual in society. In Eastern culture, the individual is under society, but in Western culture, we put the individual above society. I mean, there's a balance point that goes between both of those. But this is really one of the parts that's fueling the emotional reaction to a lot of these issues. People believe that they're upholding individualism, when in China, if you start talking to people, they will say, look, this individual stuff is fine as far as it goes. But quite frankly, the needs of society are greater and must be taken care of first.
That's an interesting point. But Mr. Keskin, is it like something you mentioned, is the U.S. trying to relive the 1980s when its rivalry, the way it had taken sort of foreign policy in the current scenario with China in this 21st century?
Oh, definitely. We have a completely different dynamics. The China in the 1980s after Deng Xiaoping, basically, we have a different China today under the Xi Jinping. Today, China is for example, China is with the 350 to 450 million middle class, with energy needs, 1.4 billion people, investing in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Europe, Middle East, basically. We have a different China and we have a different dynamics. And we have a different United States today. Do not forget, we should remember that United States, since 1980s, there has been a demographic changes in the United States. These demographic changes changed local politics, domestic politics in the United States. As a result, we see the emerging trend of the populism in the United States. As a result, Trump came to power. Trump is a result of this populism and demographic changes in the United States. And these demographic changes, they will affect the domestic changes, basically, will affect the foreign policy of the United States. This is one of them, and as well as the China. China also is the different China. China is a global power today, second largest world economy. Investing all over the world, have a different relation with the different countries. China is more pragmatic today than the ideological, basically.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Turgul Keskin, joining us from Shanghai. Coming back to you, Mr. Tangen, the question that is about what the U.S. is essentially envisaging in terms of deterring China's rapid rise, whether it's economic or military, it sort of keeps saying that they're making, when it comes to South China Sea, the role that has been, or the U.S. tries to sort of portray that they're trying to make China follow international law. There was a very much talked about conference earlier on in Canada where the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Chief, Admiral Philip Davidson, he talked about during his speech how it was important. He was essentially rallying, it was a rallying cry almost from him to get allies on board to deter China in its presence in South China Sea. This is happening side by side to what is unfolding in terms of this law that has been passed by the U.S. and, about Hong Kong and the protesters and maintaining human rights. I mean, it goes ahead and shows that the U.S. is feeling very insecure in its moves on how China is progressing forward.
Ayza, you put your finger on it, and that is this complete confusion about what the policy is that the U.S. is pursuing. I mean, on one hand, you have a very transactional president who keeps talking about things which don't seem to make sense, this kind of deficit idea, and that he's going to, America's going to win, and he doesn't really care too much about everybody else. That's not very diplomatic, and that's not going to earn him a lot of points. On the other hand, you have the hard ideologues pushing this American exceptionalism. So, when you start putting this together, it doesn't make sense. You don't know exactly where it's going, and everybody is trying to figure out, if there's an end game. At this point, I think everyone should be looking at what the world will be post-Trump, and that not only means internationally, but also domestically. I mean, the Republican Party does not stand for what it stood for prior to Donald Trump being elected. It is not about against deficits. It's not about small government. It's not about containment of state. I mean, it's about states' rights. It really has changed tremendously. The only thing that is left is this kind of social conservatism, which involves this issue of abortion. Other than that, there's nothing left except a cult of personality. Internationally, what you have is a situation where the next president, assuming there is a change, whether it's in 1 year or 5 year, will spend most of their first term trying to repair the damage done by Donald Trump during his term in office, trying to figure out how to get your neighbors back online and things like this. So from this perspective, we shouldn't be reading too much into this in terms of policy and things like that. The U.S. is, 360 degrees of pressure. They're putting Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and Hong Kong.
No, but it is coming at a critical time. Here, let me just welcome another voice, Mr. Zeno Leoni. He's a teaching fellow in Challenges to the International Order at Defence Studies Department, King's College, London, joining us from London. Welcome to Newswire. Mr. Leoni, what essentially we're trying to break down here is the lack of, it seems, U.S. foreign policy when it comes to China. A real mess, it appears, how they're moving forward in trying to curtail what they see as a military and economic threat in the New World Order. I mean, there has been various studies, and a more recent one by the University of Sweden evaluated and said essentially that at the moment China has enough missiles to virtually neutralize all American assets in East Asia within hours if there is an outbreak of war. Now, if this is the kind of situation that stands, it begs the question that wouldn't the U.S. foreign policy at this crucial point have to be more cautious as opposed to what we are seeing unfolding in front of our eyes now?
Yes, as you say, I don't think the U.S. has the military strength to go comfortably at war with China. And so I think that's off the agenda. I think, however, there is a lot of coherency in the way U.S. foreign policy towards China has run since Obama through Trump, particularly in terms of foreign economic policy. Basically, the objective of the United States is to contain China's technological power, is to trying to coerce China into becoming a more free market actor, because China's state capitalism is the strength of China, which then translated also into geopolitical strength. So both the TPP and Trump's tariff, in different ways, but very coherently in a long strategic term, from a strategic point of view, they try to lead China towards towards free market reforms. Of course, China does not intend to do that. This is one of their core interests, because they understand that this kind of symbiotic relationship between the state and their state-owned enterprises, it represents the strength of the Chinese model, which also translates militarily, of course, in the long term. So I see quite a lot of coherence in that regard.
And the way this is holding at a time, fighting for what they say human rights, promoting democracy across the world, and in parallel, US-China trade war, which has been going on for months on end now, tariff upon tariff, being slapped on by both countries on each other's goods. How do you see this moving forward from this point on?
I think if it was for Trump, he would have tried to continue to establish, a positive relationship to conclude phase one in the trade negotiations, because that's what he needs to go to 2020 elections and tell his voters, look, I fought hard, I achieved something, vote for me again.
Right.
So I think the Senate convinced Trump Trump has to follow the Senate, basically. I don't think it's exactly what he wanted to do. But anyway, rule of law, human rights are a key feature of U.S. foreign policy, a key geopolitical instruments. I think the British left China with a kind of a poison apple, which is Hong Kong. Nowadays, the United States is exploiting that, is using that to further its geopolitical interest.
And Mr. Tangen, is this exploitation, as Mr. Leoni has pointed out, also going across on the military agenda? Like I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Chief Admiral Phillip, when he said in his speech that international security was essentially in question here with China's aggressive moves in the South China Sea. But at the same time, we have seen a lot of activity by the Pentagon in those waters of U.S. naval ships sailing ridiculously close to territories, which is what China claims its sovereign land.
Yeah, this is provocation, selling arms to Taiwan, encouraging Taiwan in terms of independence, also with Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. All of these are hot button issues for China. The U.S. knows it. From Donald Trump's point of view, transactional, he believes this is great because he thinks that these are ways of destabilizing China so that he can get a better economic deal. I don't think he really cares too much about ideology one way or another, and maybe in a very vague kind of way. He's not somebody who follows, TPP, withdrawing from the climate accord. This was not the way to get everyone together and pursue this kind of rule of law, international norms type of thing. He went right off the table immediately upon taking office. So I don't think there's any coherence in what he's doing. I do agree that there was a poison apple. In terms of the military situation, yes, unfortunately, these are the kinds of things that result in flashpoints. You see, last week, China, Russia, Iran are coming together to have some sort of military exercise. China's also doing it with Saudi Arabia. So China's trying to, in their mind, stabilize issues, things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're trying to make sure that there isn't competition. They have the most to lose because they need resources shipped in and they need markets to ship their value-added things out. The U.S. knows this, and by threatening, in essence, the South China Seas, and the next step would be some sort of blockade or something like that. They know that this could be tremendous harm to the Chinese economy if they're not able to, put ideological pressure on them for China to move that way, which I would agree with my colleague will not happen.
Right. And Mr. Leoni, at the same time, meanwhile, top American officials, the Pentagon, they've upped the rhetorical ante in trying to get support in containing this China's economic and military assertiveness. How far do you think they're succeeding in getting that kind of support from long-term allies, and even in countries they're trying to start a new sort of bond over this?
Yes, this is a good question because it comes at a very important time, and this is, in my view, a big test to check what's the state of health of U.S. hegemony. To what extent the U.S. can still, get its allies around its agenda. It is becoming increasingly difficult. Many countries from Europe through Southeast Asia are split. They have massive debates within each countries. You tend to see security establishment quite wary about China and the 5G, but you tend to see then businessmen communities, business associations, which are very, very open-minded about China. And given how important, particularly at this time of history, the economy and money is really, I think it will be increasingly difficult for security establishment to make a good case to adopt an assertive stance towards China. And in fact, if you read a book from Luttwak, you find out that the United States, according to these famous strategies, had 3 different foreign policies towards China. So one from the Treasury, one from the Pentagon, one from the State Department. This means that it's really difficult to have nowadays a coherent foreign policy and an assertive foreign policy towards China, because there are too many interests at stake. So I think it's a great test for U.S. power.
It's a great test for power. It's also a good time to see how the U.S. foreign policy turns out at a point in history as it's unfolding, where tensions between two behemoths is getting higher and higher, not only on the trade front, but also on the military front. And all of this is also proving to be a major distraction of what's unfolding in the U.S., which we will be discussing more about in our next segment. But here we've got to take a short break. Thank you so much, Mr. Tangen and Mr. Leoni, for joining us here on Newswire. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, U.S. President Trump's lawyers have announced that they will not participate in the House's Judiciary Committee's first public impeachment hearing that is expected to be held on Wednesday. They're calling it unfair. However, they haven't ruled out that they won't participate in future such committee meetings, hearings. They have given a list, the lawyer has given a list of complaints he has, reasons as to why they see this as lacking impartiality, including the question of the anonymity of witnesses that is being maintained after a whistleblower expressed concerns in a letter about the president's phone call on July 25th to Ukraine's president, saying there were concerns that this was an attempt to strong-arm Ukraine's president in taking out Trump's rivals ahead of the U.S. 2020 presidential campaign. Now, there have been various incidents in this impeachment hearing process that has been going on for several weeks now, where Mr. Trump has been seen as trying to block witnesses and documents through this process, calling it a deranged witch hunt. Mr. Trump, instead, at the moment, instead of attending this hearing on Wednesday, left for the NATO summit in London. Now, where does this hearing stand as a result of nobody representing the president or the White House representatives being a part of this hearing? How does this affect President Trump's case? And what can we expect in the Wednesday hearing? All of this and more we will be discussing with our guests. We have with us Mr. Brian Frydenborg, an analyst from New York City. He'll be talking to us about this from Boston today. And Mr. Onur Erim, a political advisor and author also. He's worked in the White House as well during the Clinton administration, and he's joining us from Istanbul. Thank you so much to both of you. Mr. Erim, this is a claim by the White House counsel that the committee has failed to establish a fair process and that this entire sort of hearing has been made to overlap with the president's appearance at the NATO summit in London. I mean, what's your opinion? What's your take on this? Do you agree with the White House counsel's claim here?
Well, first of all, let's lay down the facts here. White House to Congress is within a walking distance. So the president probably did, or even if not, will have ample opportunities to defend himself if that's the way to go at this time. Let's not forget, the entire impeachment process is a discussion as to how much of it is political and how much of it is actually judicial. And I think we're going to see a good test of that during this process with President Trump. But I do believe that on the President Trump side, he is working this out pretty good, turning this into probably a campaign process where he comes out as a winner no matter how it goes. Now, let's not forget the impeachment process itself is a pretty hard process to see through. And from what we could see, President Trump is taking every opportunity to make sure that this falls on his lap the way he likes it. And we will probably see in the days coming that President Trump will do all he can to make sure this plays out the way that will favor him in the campaign trail.
Okay, Mr. Brian, coming back to, is President Trump, in your opinion, being given ample opportunities to defend himself? We've heard what our other guests had to say here, but do you feel like what the White House counsel has claimed recently about him not showing up on Wednesday's hearing has any sort of credibility to it?
it's his counsel, it's his surrogates in the Republican Party and on the committee who are going to be representing him.
Right.
And he has tried to delegitimize this process from the start, as have his people, as has the right-wing media machine. And it just makes absolutely no sense that he's not being given a fair shake, because his counsel was invited to participate, was invited to be able to cross-examine any of the witnesses, and he himself declined to send his counsel to participate in that proceeding, and he's going to be relying instead on his surrogates in Congress. But the fact of the matter is, he's trying to delegitimate the entire process, to say that it's a sham, it's a witch hunt.
Right.
And so there's a debate within the White House as to whether or not the president participates. Does that legitimize the process somewhat or not? Eventually, you would think that he's going to send some of his own lawyers there to be more involved, but this makes a nice publicity stunt. But frankly, almost everything coming from the White House at this point is going to be a publicity stunt, because it's obvious what happened, and they're trying to create a set of alternate reality facts that are not even applicable. They're going to try and have a separate impeachment trial for Biden and his son, except Biden is not in the White House right now. Biden's not a sitting official, and Hunter Biden is not under investigation by Congress.
They've been pretty much clear there's not enough evidence against them. But I mean, is the question really here being addressed in this impeachment hearing is whether what President Trump did, is this an impeachable offense also? I mean, this is something that is going to be addressed in this hearing on Wednesday by constitutional scholars, and some of those who support President Trump, his close allies, who've been rallying for him. I mean, they've made the claim that this kind of a discussion has already taken place. So this is a publicity stunt by the House themselves to try and get sort of the wrong kind of attention towards President Trump. Do you think there's any credibility in that?
That is also absurd, because there are multiple committees that have jurisdiction over these types of situations, but ultimately the Judiciary Committee is the one that really runs the impeachment process, ends up producing articles of impeachment and voting on them before they go to the House floor. But the Democrats' strategy was to have the Intelligence Committee focus on gaining the information and presenting it to the public, and presenting it in such a way where they can come up with a report that's going to be sent to the committee, which is going to happen very soon, and then the committee is going to be acting on the findings of that report. So they're going in stages, and they're having different aspects. For example, if there's a terrorist attack in the United States, the FBI is going to be involved, but the CIA will be involved in looking into any overseas situations, and you'll have local law enforcement is involved as well. So you have different bodies that are involved, but ultimately the Judiciary Committee is going to be the one that decides whether or not to send articles of impeachment to the House floor.
So, but Mr. Erim, you've said, we've talked about this a little bit, but just sort of reiterating a point, if this really was the kind of witch hunt that President Trump has called it to be, and if the president has nothing to hide, hasn't done anything wrong, wouldn't this Wednesday hearing be that kind of opportunity to come forth? Because various polls are showing right now that those in favor of him are really those who have already voted for him, like him, mostly right-wing, mostly Republicans, and those who want him out as a result of these impeachment hearings, had already voted Democrats. I mean, so the vote is divided on party lines as it is. So couldn't this have been a really favorable thing for him to actually have shown up for this hearing, or had a representative represent him?
You're right. It absolutely would be. But let's not, let's bear in mind that he hasn't lost that opportunity. He could be just as well, building this up to a point where he comes out as a rock star out of this. So, it's his opportunity to answer, or to throw back all these accusations against him is not lost yet. He may just be waiting for the right moment, for the peak moment where he as I said, he comes out with flashing stars. Let's not forget the American people who actually voted for Trump. The indications that they're still not fully satisfied as to what this is. And Trump has a very good way of comebacks, especially when he gets up on the podium. So he may just be waiting for the better time. Also, the longer he drags this, the closer it gets to the election date, Trump is going to be better off. Let's not forget that. So this could all be a part of Trump's plan in the grand scheme of things to get on the podium just at the right time. So we'll have to wait and see about that.
And Mr. Frydenborg, this sort of take that Mr. Erim has, that he's trying to, elongate the process as it'll work out more in his favor as they come closer to the elections. President Trump has again raised the possibility of appealing this to the Supreme Court. He's tweeted while in London saying that, can we take this to the Supreme Court to avert a possible impeachment? Can the president take this, first of all, to the Supreme Court? And do you agree that this would be in his favor to elongate this whole process, to delay this entire process?
Once again, we are in the realm of the theater of absurdity with the president. I do agree with my colleague in his saying that this is an effort by Trump to find the best way to manipulate public opinion, manipulate the media, to insert himself in the right moment and right way at the right time as far as his people consider. But the issue that we have is that both the Democrats and the White House are kind of gambling because no one really knows how this is going to turn out. But what we do know is that impeachment is inherently a political process. You cannot legally prosecute the United States for particularly criminal offenses and remove him from office that way by sending, the Department of Justice or your local law enforcement. Congress has the ability to impeach, first impeach from the House and then convict and remove from the Senate. And ultimately, it's whatever Congress decides. And this has nothing to do with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will be ruling in on various aspects. For example, Don McGahn has been ordered by several federal judges to testify, and that appeals process is already underway, and it should eventually make its way to the Supreme Court. But the way the founders designed the system is that the Senate will ultimately have the final say, and it's a political yes or no. It's not about whether or not the president committed a particular legal crime. It's about whether or not the Senate feels that high crimes and misdemeanors, including bribery, which is exactly what happened. Let's be clear, the president was on a phone call with the Ukrainian president, said, we have a lot of money and we might even let you have a visit at the White House if you do what I'm asking you to do, which is a specific political favor to damage his political opponent. Everybody knows what this is, and everything that the White House is saying right now is gaslighting. And it's just a matter of presenting farce and lies to the public over and over again. And by the way, this is a Kremlin disinformation tactic to manipulate public opinion, to pressure the senators who will be voting on impeach on whether or not removing the president for office is going to happen. And that's his ultimate goal, is he keep as much pressure on the senators as possible by whipping up his base, by having public opinion be muddied, by having the facts be muddied, and by having confusion and disinformation reign. And so that's what's so sad about this. This is not playing out the way it should be. The founders intended to have the president be correctly represented by his council, by his people, whoever it was. There was going to be a process, and the president is turning it upside down.
Right. And Mr. Erim, on top of that, the Republicans have a majority in the Senate. I mean, if they're going to have the last say here, they're most likely not going to ever vote for him to be impeached, to him to be removed, especially based on evidence of that phone call, which has not been disclosed fully. I mean, President Trump had promised to release a fully declassified transcript, which he did not. They were just notes of the phone call. How do you see this moving forward in the days ahead?
I think, first of all, as my colleague said, this, unfortunately, impeachment is a political process rather than a judicial process, which is more of what it should be. But let's make sure that Republican Party decides, without a doubt, that their 2020 candidate is Trump. I think that's going to change a lot of things. If there is no serious candidacy other than the Trump on the Republican side, which I don't foresee, then the way Republicans will act in the Congress will be obvious. If not, we could see some different things. Let's not forget, impeaching a president in the U.S. under the U.S. law is not that easy. It's a very hard process to go through, especially when you have a divided Congress like this, a little bit favoring on the Republican side. So again, not only the decision will be a political one, but the way that the path that it leads to what the decision of especially the Republicans will be also a political one. If we don't see another candidacy, a serious candidacy on the Republican side that could force Trump out of being the candidate, we could see a different story, which I don't foresee at all. But if not,
Okay.
this
is a good point. Indeed, how the Republicans decide to move forward with their final presidential candidate for the 2020 elections could also essentially seal the fate for Mr. Trump here. Let's not forget, this is not the first time he is being scrutinized over his alleged connections, foreign connections. His 2016 election campaign was also investigated over alleged ties to Russia. And that inquiry, however, did not establish a criminal conspiracy, but at the same time did not exonerate the president. Thank you so much, Mr. Erim and Mr. Frydenborg, for giving your analysis on this. That's all the time we have for today. We will see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.